Okay, we're going to get started in just a second here. Okay, all right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Kelsey Corlett-Rivera, and I'm the librarian here at McKeldin. So I work as the liaison to the School of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures. I'm happy to see a lot of folks here representing the SLLC today. And I'm also head of our Research Commons, which sponsors events like Speaking of Books and other events that we run to feature research that's being done here on campus. Okay? So I want to welcome everybody to our third event for Speaking of Books for 2018. We're having a really bang-up semester right now. So the series was actually started by the libraries in 2005 to showcase some of the research being published by faculty members here on campus. And today I'm really happy to be welcoming Dr. Valerie Orlando, who's going to discuss her book, The Algerian New Novel, The Poetics of a Modern Nation. So before Valerie gets started, I'm going to go ahead and mention a couple of our upcoming Speaking of Books events, just in case you'd like to come back after the great show that we're about to experience today. On April 5th at 4 o'clock here in 6137, we're going to welcome Sahar Khamis, who will be, just walked in, who will be speaking of Arab women's activism and socio-political transformations, unfinished gendered revolutions. So we're looking forward to that. We have Stephen Mansbach, who's actually going to be speaking over in the Michelle Smith Collaboratory for Visual Culture, which is in the Art and Sociology building, on his book titled Advancing a Different Modernism. That's April 19th from 4:30 to 6. And we just scheduled, so it's not up on the website yet, we'll have Dr. Robert Childs, who will be speaking about the Revolution of 28 on April 26th at 4 o'clock in this room. So we also already have a few events scheduled for fall 2018, so keep an ear out for those. If you signed up on the way in, we have a new newsletter that we're using to help get the word out about events like this, so you'll be one of the first to know. You could also sign up on the way out if you didn't have a chance to do that on your way in. Okay, so without further ado, Dr. Valerie K. Orlando is Professor of French and Francophone Literatures in the Department of French and Italian at the University of Maryland, College Park, where she also serves as head. She is the author of 6 books, 2 of which came out in 2017. The Algerian New Novel, The Poetics of a Modern Nation from 1950 to 1979 out of the University of Virginia Press, and New African Cinema out of Rutgers University Press. She has written numerous articles on Francophone writing from the African diaspora, African cinema, and French literature and culture. She is also series editor for After the Empire, The Francophone World and Post-Colonial France from Lexington Books. So copies of Professor Orlando's book are actually available for purchase today in the back, and I'm sure she would be more than happy to sign them for you after she finishes speaking. So it's your chance to pick up a signed copy of this edition. Okay, so I'd like everybody to please join me in welcoming Dr. Valerie Orlando.
So I hope my little mic thing is working. Everyone can hear me okay. And you do need a handout because I have quotes in there which won't make much sense if you don't have one. I think there are a few other copies up here. And everyone can hear me okay in the back? Maro, can you hear me? Okay, well, I'd really like to thank Kelsey and the organizers here of this library series. Kelsey has really been a supporter of my work for ever since she arrived. She arrived a few years after me, and she's helped me get some really obscure text, find some obscure text over the years, and I really want to thank her for that because she's just always so responsive and helpful. And I'd also like to thank all my department colleagues who came on the day that they're usually not teaching. That was really, thank you very much for that. And my graduate students. And actually this book came out of a graduate seminar that I taught in 2012. It was an idea that I had, and I sort of used my graduate students as guinea pigs to see if it would work. And it did. I mean, for me it did. And then this book sort of came out of that 4 years later. So that's the process that usually happens with me. I usually try things out in grad courses or even undergrad courses, and they materialize later in some kind of written form. And I'd also like to, since this is International Women's Day, I can't say enough wonderful things about two Algerian women authors who really have been the backbone of my work, even when I was in graduate school. And that, of course, is Asaya Jabar, who unfortunately left us in 2015, but I mean, she is just a phenomenal figure of writing. A lot of her works have been translated into English. She's I can't say enough things about her. And the second author, who also is very influential in my book, and I've written about her over the years, is Yamina Meshakra, and she's not as well known. She only wrote 2 books and an essay, and these have never been translated into English, but La Grotte Éclatée is one of the chapters in my book which I talk about her. So I'm dedicating this speech to these ladies in honor of International Women's Day. So scholars of Algerian novels of French expression written in the 1950s and 60s have, for the most part, studied this literary period through the lens of what we call la littérature de combat, or literature of revolution, or literally combat. The works of well-known authors such as Kateb Yassine, Mohamed Dib, Malek Haddad are most often contextualized in relation to their response to colonization and the Algerian War of Liberation, which ended in 1962 and began in 1954. However, I maintain in my book that few academics have looked at canonical Algerian literature of French expression from this era as part of the larger literary production of experimental avant-garde forms devised by authors writing in French during the decades of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Particularly, I argue, the French Nouveau Roman was very influential in offering Algerian authors an experimental novelistic space in which to explore their nascent post-colonial subjecthood as free agents who would exercise their being in the world, to use Heidegger's term. And this being in the world promotes an idea of worldhood, as he suggests, of course, in his monumental tome, Being in Time, which came out later in 1962. He writes that an individual's being, quote, is bound to the being of others that she or he encounters within his or her own world, end quote. So my book considers not only the literary production of a certain cohort of Algerian authors of French expression writing during the period of 1950 to 1979, but also how their novels both influenced and were reflectors of the post-colonial and cultural transformations that took place during the 29-year time period in Algeria. The work seeks to conceptualize the Algerian novel as reflecting the true definition of poetics, and as distinguished from hermeneutics by its focus on not only the meaning of the text, but more particularly an understanding of how the text reflects the sociocultural and political milieu in which the author is writing. I ask the question, how does a uniquely Algerian poetics affect the reader in his or her understanding of the socio-political and cultural climate of a nation in formation? As literary critic Tsvetsin Todorov notes, literary poetics must be first and foremost understood as breaking down, quote, the symmetry established between interpretation and science in the field of literary studies. Poetics does not seek to name meaning, but aims at a knowledge of the general laws that preside over the birth of each work. Poetics is therefore an approach to literature at once abstract and internal, end quote. It is the goal of my work, then, to analyze Algerian authors of French expression within this interstitial space of poetics between the abstract and the internal. The qualities of the space reflect the experimental styles of literature conceptualized in the 1950s, certainly by French new novelists. The French new novel offered an open form through which Algerian authors explored the internal, socio-political and cultural particularities of their situation, as well as psychologically probed the challenges facing a nation in formation in the 1960s and 70s. The new novel, known for having no form at all, conceived by Alain Robbe-Grillet and contributed to by Nathalie Serrault, Claude Ollier, Michel Boutor, among many others, sought to free itself from the static notions of the novel that these authors stated had been most profoundly forged in the 19th century by the Grand Récit, or the great narratives of those great canonical authors such as Balzac, Flaubert, and Zola. They felt that this canonical form of the novel was not applicable to expressing the world in the mid-20th century. In the post-World War II era, authors in France faced what Jean Faber notes was the ruin of the formulaic novel in French, which they felt was not adequate for expressing, quote, the destruction of the world, which left man struck dumb and gaping, end quote. They affirmed, as Faber remarks, that, quote, the new novel would allow for the incredible possibility of re-beginning, end quote. And what was so appealing about the new novel's non-form? Its penchant for psychologically distressed protagonists, unformed plots, time manipulations, and in general stories that led nowhere. These non-notions provided a tabula rasa on which to envision, as Robbe-Grillet would note in an essay he writes in 1963, quote, a new world for a new man of tomorrow, end quote. In addition to tearing down the canonical novel, French new novelists looked to modernist American authors, Jean Dos Passos, Ernest Hemingway, William Faulkner, and others for inspiration. They were intrigued by their innovative writing styles and psychological probings of society and culture. It is William Faulkner to whom Kateb Yassine turns to conceptualize themes of racial discrimination, misery, and the ravages of colonialism bound up in the land of Algeria, as notes Abdelkabir Bouchentouf in his work, William Faulkner et Kateb Yassine, écrivains du terroir, so writers of the land. In both authors' novels, quoting Bouchentouf, the land plays an active role in the work, sometimes the most important role, since it influences how the characters become, end quote. Jacqueline Arnaud, Kateb's longtime friend and colleague, in the compilation of the many poems and essays, relates in her work that Kateb discovered Faulkner while living in Paris in 1947. Arnaud, as well as many other scholars, has cited Faulkner as having had a major influence on Kateb's ephemeral, nebulous writing style, used most notably in his first novel, Nejma, from 1956. While writing this monumental work, Kateb was avidly reading Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, Absalon, Absalon, and Light in August, which all had been translated into French in the 40s. Kateb underscores his respect for Faulkner as exemplary of the innovative modern novel in an interview with filmmaker René Bautier. In this interview, Kateb draws the distinction between Faulkner and fellow Algerian Albert Camus. Kateb stresses that although Camus and Faulkner are from colonialist environments, and he uses the word colonialist, they differed in how they interacted with the colonized, or in Faulkner's case, the black man in the South. Unlike Camus, Kateb notes, quote, Faulkner's racism did not occlude the Negro, but rather engaged with him and spoke his language. Camus' works, on the other hand, were not only devoid of the Arab or Berber presence, they did not even demonstrate the slightest curiosity for their lives or indeed their language, which Camus did not speak, end quote. In France, American modernists were key to the goals of post-war French authors who were seeking to develop something novelistically new in the aftermath of World War II. Author and existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, writing for the Atlantic Monthly here in the United States, explains that the American modernist novel would be key to orienting new literary paths for French authors. This is a long quote, but I'll just read a few lines. The American novel took its place, together with jazz and the movies, among the best of the importations from the United States. America became for us the country of Faulkner and Dos Passos, just as it had already been the home of Louis Armstrong, King Vidor, the blues. What fascinated us all really was the constant flow of men across a whole continent, the exodus of an entire village to the orchards of California, the hopeless wanderings of the hero in Light in August, and the uprooted people who drifted along in the mercy of the storms in the 42nd parallel. In the aftermath of World War II and the impending colonial wars to come in the 1950s and 60s, for Sartre and the new novelists, the modern world was a world devoid of order, where the individual was faced with choices that left few options, as she or he struggled to establish his or her place and sense of being in the world. Algerian authors rallying for decolonization after the war were of like minds. Certainly those depicted here were engagés in the sense that they were committed to socio-political transformations during the post-war period and during the decades before, during, and after the Algerian Revolution, as Algeria fought to free itself from 132 years of French colonial rule, and then subsequently to build a new nation. Engagé, as Jean-Paul Sartre defined it in his 1948 Qu'est-ce que la littérature, or What is Literature, meant that the author's primary duty was to comment on the socio-political transitions taking place in one's society. In the 1950s, Mohamed Dib's L'Incendie, which translates as The Fire, from 1954, Kateb Yassin's Nejma from 1956, Assaya Jabar's La Soif from 1957, and Malek Haddad's La Dernière Impression from 1958, were some of the first novels to posit the possibility of a post-colonial Algeria, hinting at the country's inevitable independence. Yet, as I hope I have proved in my book, revolutionary aspirations aside, these authors, highly schooled in the nuances of the French language, some educated in the most elite colonial institutions of the time, as well as the Sorbonne in Paris, were also very deeply influenced by the experimental styles and forms of French novelistic writing of the era, most notably the Nouveau Roman. So I postulate in my book that the Nouveau Roman's form, which in fact connotes no form at all, allowed for a new means by which to contextualize Algerian identity and conceptions of time and history, all of which had been compromised and interrupted by French colonialism, begun in Algeria in 1830 and ending in 1962. By virtue of its purely unstructured form, the new novel afforded new ways of conceiving narrative modes that could accommodate points of reference that were not French but Algerian. As the colonial system was collapsing, what amounted to challenging novelistic convention in France was transformed by Algerian authors into the awakening of political and social consciousness and the expression of a national identity for the new nation to be born. The new novel offered Algerian writers what Alain Rogrier professed was a nouveau roman pour l'homme nouveau, or a new novel for a new man or woman. He was using man in the sense of humankind. In the world of tomorrow. Quelle est la place de l'homme sur la terre? What is the place of man on the earth, he asked, and what will be the role of literature in defining his place? In a series of articles he wrote in the 1950s and 60s, which were later published in 1963 as Pour un nouveau roman, or For a New Novel, Robbe-Grillet sought to define the parameters of his unstructured novel form. So this quote from him comes from For a New Novel. I readily employ the term new novel. It is not to designate a school nor even a specific and constituted group of writers working in the same direction. The expression is merely a convenient label applicable to all those seeking new forms of the novel, forms capable of expressing or of creating new relations between man and the world, to all those who have determined to invent the novel, in other words, to invent man in the world today, for the world and man of tomorrow. Parallel to Robbe-Grillet's writing about the genre that he thought would refuse to be one, the years 1950 to 1979 are significant when considering the development of the avant-garde experimental styles by Algerian authors of French expression. The almost 30-year time span serves as the historical backbone of the theoretical and literary analyses explored in my study. I chose 1950 as a point of departure for several reasons. Most important, the year marks the beginning of the end of French colonial empire in Indochina, with the Battle of Route Coloniale 4, Route Colonial 4 in 1950, followed by the decisive Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954 in Vietnam. These battles ultimately forced the French out of Indochina. The losses subsequently set off a domino effect of rebellions across the colonies, accumulating in the war in Algeria from 1954 to 1962, and its independence, thus marking the end of French colonialism in Africa as of 1962. The early 1950s also marked Algerian authors' departure from more insular ethnographic narratives written during the colonial period, as seen in Mouloud Feraoun's Le Fils du Pauvre from 1950, and the earlier writing of Tao Amarrouche's, notably Jacinthe Noire from 1947. These works, and these works are very canonical and very weighty in the canon of Algerian literature. These works characterize nativeness interpretations of Algerian culture and society, and stylistically revealed what revolutionary theorist Frantz Fanon designates in Les Damnés de la Terre as the first phase of writing by the colonized author seeking to mimic the styles of his colonial master. As calls for decolonization erupt, this mimicry eventually gives way to the revolutionary text of Rebellion, where the native author addresses his people as he forms through his writing the parameters of the nation to come. By 1979, as scholar Reda Benzmaya notes, Algeria as a democratic nation was purely, quote, an imaginendum, end quote, an idealized myth found present only in the past of the Algerian Revolution. The country by 1979 had disintegrated into what Benzmaya notes was, quote, discordance and violence, triggering a radical questioning of identity in the concept of the nation, end quote. This identity crisis contributed to further social unrest and eventually to the Civil War of the 1990s. But during the 1970s, Algerian authors writing in French, many forced to live in exile, disappointed by the unfulfilled promises of the post-colonial nation, turned to commenting on the Algerian Revolution for what it had not transformed. But turning now back to the literary historical time frame of 1950 to 1979. During this time, we can trace European and American modernist avant-garde styles as influences in not only the early works of Kateb Yassine, Mohamed Dib, and Assaya Jabak, but also Rachid Boujetra, Nabil Fares, and Yamina Meshakra, writing in the late 60s to mid-70s. These authors were also influenced thematically by African American authors who themselves had and were fighting for human and civil rights here in the United States. Authors such as James Baldwin, Richard Wright, who both lived in France for most of their writing careers, and Ralph Ellison, among others, shaped the words of equality and justice in, for example, Kateb Yassin's Nejma from 1956, and his later Le Polygone Étoilé from 1966. And in the early 70s, Nabil Fares's Un Passager de l'Occident, which was published in 1971, and in which Baldwin actually makes an appearance. It is in these foreign works, Algerian authors saw paths to modes of expression that would help them articulate what would be the reality of the new nation to come. They would use these modes to create their own blends of Western and Algerian literary devices as to explore their particular experiences. Thus, looking at the influences on Algerian authors' works from the early 50s through the 60s to the end of the 70s, we see manipulations of time as influenced by Faulkner, questions of truth and justice as espoused in the writings of James Baldwin and Richard Wright, and, of course, the fragmented narratives and spiraling repetitions engulfing effaced central protagonists as seen in the works, these works here, Le Voyeur, La Jalousie, Le Labyrinthe, or dans le Labyrinthe by Robe Grier, and certainly La Mise en Scène and Le Maintien de l'Ordre by Claude Ollier from 1961. And these are just some of the examples. When reading Algerian authors from most certainly the early 50s, we also have to consider to what extent writers use the committed, engagé, sociopolitically driven existentialist philosophy, espoused, of course, by our friend Jean-Paul Sartre, to blend with the modernist experimental narrative forms of the time. Thus, I began my quest with a series of questions that involved an enigma. How did the French new novelists and the early American modernists, with their nihilistic views and their disaffected anti-heroes, influence the writing of revolutionary Algerian authors such as Kateb Yassin, whose Nejma founded the literary voice that later expressed the essence of liberation ideologies, movements, and eventual post-coloniality? As I noted earlier, although Robe Grier, founder of the New Novel group in France, professed that he had no interest in making the Nouveau Roman into a socio-political tool to critique the turmoil of the era, the avant-garde characteristics of the genre nevertheless allowed for voices of protest to construct a literature of opposition in Algeria long after the 1950s and even independence. Rachid Boujedre's L'Escargot Entêté and Mohamed Dib's Abel, both published in 1977, are examples of authors who used the new novel's lack of structure as a literary device to critique the socio-political and ideological tensions and legacies of the Algerian Revolution in the ensuing decades after independence. Much like their European and American modernist counterparts, authors Boujedre and Dib depict the angst of the modern individual. In the Algerian context, this individual is stuck in the uncertainty of the new Algerian post-colonial state, emerging from having been laid waste by France and hindered later by what became increasingly a despotic one-party nation. So what does the experimental Algerian novel look like? So for the remaining minutes of the talk, this is where the professor comes in and gives you a lesson in the style. I will present 3 examples spanning from 1966 to 1972, specifically looking at the works of Kateb Yassin, Mohamed Dib, and Nabil Fares. Mohamed Dib's 1968 novel La Danse du Roi, or The Dance of the King, captures the fragmented subjecthood of the individual in crisis in the immediate post-colonial moment of the mid to late 1960s. However, the context of the novel is set earlier during the revolutionary years from 1954 to 1962. It is the story of a small group of freedom fighters fighting for Algerian liberty. Dib, though, is not interested in their political struggle, but rather in the relationship between them as they seek to define themselves in revolutionary Algeria. The author is particularly interested in developing the relationship between the main male character, Rodouan, and Arfia, a woman, as they struggle to determine who they are and where, figuratively, they are going. And in the larger context, what their being in the world will look like after independence is won. There is no defining plot development. Rodouan is constantly in flux, as notes Peter Hallward, who suggests that, quote, Rodouan searches for a self rooted in history that at the same time marches towards a better future through a collective coming into consciousness, end quote. The incessant speaking voice, noted in italics throughout the novel, is protagonist Rodouan's subconscious, which breaks as an already fragmented narrative into small snippets of history and his story, suggesting the difficulty of the individual to formulate his being in a nation that has just come through collective trauma and is seeking to promote itself as unified. The desire for individuality, thus to stand out as a new man in a new world, is captured in the voices that interact with Dib's protagonist subconscious. Again, it's always written in italics. So the voice illustrates this potential individual who cannot distinguish himself in the chaos of the evolving new nation. And that's handout number 1, and I just highlighted in yellow the tension between the voice that is bouncing, as he says, on Rodouan as if it was spying on him, couching down in a crevice of these rocks, and then the subconscious saying to him, without it being possible to pair it with a face, that is, to pair this identity that he can't find with an actual tangible being in the world. So Dib's tenuous protagonist seeking to define himself, his subjecthood, to pair it with a face from the shadows of the past in the new reality of post-colonial Algeria, mirrors the earlier angst of central figure Lakhdar, who appears in Kateb Yassin's 1956 Nejma and the later 1966 Le Polygone Étoilé. These protagonists are individuals who seek to define their je néant, or the negated nothingness I. This negated I is characteristic of an absent narrator who is both there and not there, caught in between a world he does not or cannot comprehend, and a past that is still opaque and unknown, effaced by centuries of colonization, first by the Ottomans and then by the French. Kateb Le Polygone Étoilé from 1966 is a novel that is also a poem. Both forms fight to become unified, yet in the end never do. Dib's and Kateb's characters from the 1960s and 70s also struggle not only to understand how they are going to form the identity of a new nation, but also how to form the self in the context of les hommes nouveaux, or the new humankind, as Robe Crier suggests in For a New Novel. In the post-colonial and post-World War planet of the 20th century. Dib and Kateb's novels search to maintain the dignity of the individual in the changing tides of socio-political, revolutionary upheaval, and the ensuing nation-building of Algeria, which turned away from the French colonizer and the French language in order to embrace fully the national slogan promoted by the leaders of the Front de Libération Nationale, or the FLN, which, quote, is Islam is my religion, Arabic is my language, and Algeria is my nation, end quote. This slogan for authors using French in the 1960s was one of the driving forces behind their socio-politically engaged writing. Metaphorically, the tension between French and Arabic is a constant throughout Kateb's novels of the 60s and 70s. He later did decide only to write in Algerian Arabic until up into the 1980s. He died in 1989. The tension between the two languages, Arabic wiping away French, or what Kateb defined as le butin de la guerre d'Algérie, the booty or the loot of the Algerian War, is verbalized up to the very end of the Polygone Étoilé. This former colonial language is both the looted booty and the source of the author's exil intérieur, or interior exile. At the end of the novel, Kateb writes, "French is a language that is banished secretly of the same accord as broken as it is concluded," end quote. He always writes in these very poetic but very enigmatic phrases that you spend hours trying to translate. For Kateb, continuing to use the French language would force him, as he notes at the end of the Polygone Étoilé, to, quote, "lose my mother and her language. Both are inherent treasures, but are all the same alienated," end quote. Alienated, that is, from his project as a writer of French expression. The singular slogan of the FLN revolution, promoting Arabic as a defining quality of the new nation, elided any other possibility or way of conceiving of a multicultural and multilingual identity for post-colonial Algeria. The country's multiculturalism, viewed by authors of French expression as vital to a democratic and inclusive nation in the post-colonial era, was stymied by a one-party system that eventually led to a one-party government. Kateb Yassin's Le Polygone Étoilé evokes the emptiness of a country where, quote, quoting from Le Polygone, Atlas himself has here deposed his burden and decided that the universe could very well be held up elsewhere than on his shoulders, end quote. For Kateb, the burden of emptiness on a slate cleaned by the revolution left the individual devoid of a sense of plural cultural rootedness. Algerian authors viewed traditional literary structures as being synonymous not only with outdated literary forms, but also colonial empire, and this is on the other hand. Indeed, French new novelist Nathalie Sarraut's affirmation that, quote, "we are living in an era of suspicion," end quote, is applicable to Kateb's and Diebe's novels written in the 1950s and 60s. Ironically, as he used the colonizers' language, what they saw in the experimental genre as revolutionaries was the novelistic space created for dismantling colonial rhetoric and the racist ideologies that has sustained the Western version of history for centuries. Years later, after independence, new literary works proposing inclusive versions of Algerian history questioned as truth not only the historical archives of the past, but also mythologized truths formed by the fathers of the new nation who had elided any alternative narratives promoting the country's multiple ethnicities and language groups. Recasting documents of historical knowledge, both colonial and revolutionary, is a literary endeavor exemplified not only in Diebe's but also Kateb's novels, and even the later works of Nabil Ferres, who I'll talk about in a minute. Working constantly in circular prose, where no one voice ever supplants another, Kateb's Le Polygone Étoilé demonstrates that language itself can be a form that provides a place where no one entity has power over another. In Le Polygone Étoilé, the very typeface and arrangement of words on pages of prose and poetry physically force the reader to think of writing as geometrical forms, as demonstrated in the examples here of a verbal polygon, the Polygone Étoilé. So if you look at that next page, you can see this circular prose, and this happens all through the book. So you're constantly forced into these geometrical forms made by the poetry, which is mixed in with the prose. Writing almost, and this here it is, bigger. Writing almost, 10 years later, Nabil Ferres, in Le Champ des Oliviers, Découverte du Monde from 1972, offers, it's too bad it's too light. We couldn't get the lights to turn off. But anyway, offers an experimental word map of a field and a sign of language and poetics that we must learn to navigate in order to attempt to understand the true ending and beginning of Algeria, both in history and its language. So if you look at this handout, it's on the back page of Catez. This word map depicts Ferres's diagram or plan of the becoming of his new Algerian world, as well as more universally, quote, the discovery of the new world, end quote, as indicated at the top of the page. It suggests the beginning and the ending of the first cycle of his identity quest that has taken place in the first 3 novels written in the early 1970s. Yahya Pas de Chance, Yahya No Luck from 1970, Un Passager de l'Occident, A Passenger in the West from 1971, and Le Champ des Oliviers, La Découverte du Monde, The Olive Garden Discovery of the World from 1972. Not only does this page from Le Champ des Oliviers map the origins of Ferres's own roots as entrenched in the stones and olive groves of his country, which he has forsaken in exile, it also denotes the beginnings of Yahya, his first book's central protagonist's own identity formation, which is also a mirror of Ferres's own. The protagonist's quest for identity, in turn, is mirrored in the quest to find the origins of his country and tribe. The U on the right-hand side of the word map means in Berber belonging, as noted in the footnote of the page. The map sign in words, if considered as a design, also stylistically forms the sign and the origins of Berber identity, the Tifinagh, the ancient symbol developed by the Phoenicians around 500 BC, represents freedom as conceptualized by the Imazigan tribe of North Africa, known as the Aza sign, or the AZA sign, of the Imazigan people. It is significant as identifying their origins and is prominently placed in the middle of the Amazigh flag. Within the New World Sign map of the Tifinagh, made from Ferres's use of language and dates, is the symbolically described bloody field of Algeria. His country emerges from Berber language and history, a history that is in post-colonial times has all but been erased. The dates of the word sign map are also symbolically important. 1938 marks the year that the French officially outlawed use of Arabic in colonial Algeria. In 1962, following independence, Arabic became the official language of Algeria, despite the fact that the country's first president, Ahmed Ben Bella, neither could read nor write it. Arabic would be a means to, as Ben Bella stated, quote, purge Algerians of their colonial past and mentality in order to rediscover an authentic national identity, end quote. However, Ferres argues in all his works up to his death in 2016 that this Arabized identity is false. For Ferres, Algerian Arab post-colonial identity was just another identity produced by a colonial force that supplanted, once again, the true North African Berber people who had been in Algeria since the dawn of time. And he emphasized this to me again in a series of interviews that I had with him in Paris in fall 2013. So he stayed true to this belief up to the bitter end. So I'm going to turn now to my conclusion. I'd like just to emphasize that the experimental novelistic expression honed in the 1950s and 70s continues to influence on many levels Algerian literature in the 2000s. One only has to consider the psychologically probing works of Maïs Bey, particularly her Surtout ne te retourne pas, Certainly Don't Look Back from 2005, the time deformations as expressed in Bourlin Sansal's 2084, The End of the World, from 2015, and the compromised identities of protagonists, as in Camille Daoud's Meursault contre-enquête or Meursault counter-investigation from 2013, which also won the Prix Goncourt in France, and Samir Toumi's L'Effacement, The Erasure, which was published in 2016, and this novel has not left Algeria. I've got it in Algeria, so he's virtually unknown outside of Algeria. Just to see how the past experimental avant-garde has remained integral to authors writing in Algeria in French. I would like to stress here that the events of history, as well as the modernist, experimental, and avant-garde styles of the mid-20th century, have infused Algeria's literary oeuvre. The experimental form of the Nouveau Roman provided Algerian authors with a platform on which to fragment the colonizer's language, and later, in the post-colonial era, this same language was used as a means to scrutinize the failures of the Algerian nation. As Algerian authors of French expression, past and present, demonstrate, the most effective way to express the tensions of modernity and the challenges of our global age are best achieved thus through the artistry of new modes of literary form. Thank you. I'm sorry, I had to condense the 328-page book.
That was great. Thank you so much, Dr. Orlando. So we'd be happy to take questions. We are recording the talk today, so I would be happy to bring the microphone over for anyone who has a question for Dr. Orlando.
Thank you, Valerie, for this excellent presentation, and I'm sure the book is as elegant as the writer. I'm not a literary expert, but I will have a question about the theme. Obviously, there has been an influence from the colonizers, as you said, on the colonized. But obviously also from your talk, we can conclude that there has been a pushback, as we would expect. So the theme of resistance, I'm just interested to find out, how did the theme of resistance emerge among these different Algerian novelists, and how did it actually differ gender-wise between the male and the female, or the women and men writers in Algeria during this period of time? Thank you, and congratulations again on the book and the excellent presentation.
Thank you. That's a really good question, and I do talk a lot about gender. I picked the three main male, on International Women's Day. That wasn't a very good idea, I think, but I just didn't have enough time. But if you look at, for example, certainly at Yamina Meshakra's work, which is very male-ish, this novel, La Grotte Éclatée, is all about the women Maquis fighters who go and fight with the men in the hills against the French. And this novel came out in 1979, and it's very poetic. It's like a fragmented, you have all these fragments, and you have to put it together as you're reading, because it's all out, the dates are all different, and you go back and forth in time and between male and female voices. And so I have to say, I think the women writing at this time were writing a lot like the men. You know, the ones who had access to using French and could really write. Katel Yassine wrote the foreword to Yamina Meshakra's novel in 1979. So she was very much a protege of his, and they were writing together in a group. So I think for this particular period of time, you know, it was, they were very, or they bought into the revolutionary socialist model of revolution, that is, you know, gender equality and fighting for a cause. So that's why I think this period is so interesting, because I really find men and women writing about the same things. I mean, Asaya Jabar's early text, the 1957 La Soif, which people have, I find not so much experimental in its style, but what she says, it's all about this young woman trying to come into her identity during this revolutionary period, and she really doesn't mention the revolution going on at the time at all, and she was criticized for that. But on the other hand, I find there are passages in there where she does challenge it, and challenge this idea that, well, if we're going to bring this revolution that is supposed to build this new society, then men and women have to engage in it equally. And that text, I mean, there are things that she does in that text that you know a young Algerian woman at the time, while bombs are going off, certainly in 1957, could never have done. Yet she does it in the novel. I go to the beach and swim, practically naked with her lover, and she pushes the envelope to all these social conventions too, which is interesting. But it's still a very kind of masculinized text. She wants equality with the men around her.
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. One of the things that always fascinated me about the authors of the Nouveau Roman was their play with the different elements of narrative, among other things, narration. And so you have a novel written in the second person by Michel Butor, and you have the Rebrier's Je Néant, the absent eye narrator of jealous. I was wondering, are there comparable strategies employed by some of the authors that you discuss?
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, Vib and Kateb were constantly playing with the I that isn't I, and then that 1968 novel by Dib, the Rodouin. I mean, you never know what only by the italics, if it's his subconscious or it's actually the character speaking. And then we do have what I talked about earlier in the paper about this internal and external way of looking at things that are very much mixed into the narrative that isn't really a narrative. Nothing happens in that novel, except that they just keep having these sort of psychological dialogues that have, I mean, they were horrendous to translate. Because it's just so, it's almost like automatic writing, it's almost like, it's the subconscious. So yeah, I mean, you really do find it, and I hope I evoke that. And Kateb Yassine, the same thing. I mean, there are these four male characters, and then Nejma is this figure who sometimes is a woman, but sometimes means star and means the nation. And she's very elusive. And at the same time, you have this radical, they're trying to push back French colonialism, but you just never know where you're in that text because every page changes, and there really isn't a story. And you have to read through Nejma and then into Le Polygone Étoilé, because Kateb's mission was really from the early 40s forward all the way up until the 70s. He wrote hundreds of pages of poetry and prose. And Jacqueline Arnaud was the first person to start looking at from day one to pretty much, well, she died in 1985. So that whole span, and she actually found that you can trace these lines, but you have to read his entire oeuvre to figure out what really happens to each character, because they're all mixed in with all these different forms, poetic, prose. Yeah. I don't know if I answered your question. Carol?
Over here first.
Okay.
Valerie, as we're coming up on the 50th anniversary of May 1968, if you could talk about the influence that this generation of Algerian writers had on the events of May 68, how they influenced the activists, the militants in that period of time.
Well, I think it's kind of the, 68, of course, Algeria was independent by 1968, but the tricontinental movement, which, I mean, Algeria in the 60s was the poster country for freedom, they inspired the movements in Latin America in the early 70s for socialist revolution. They influenced the third world movement ideologies of the time. So I think it's more they were influencing people outside rather than the other way around. Really, Algeria was going to save the formerly colonized world because it was going to be the model to follow. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. I don't want to be disrespectful, but for these authors who were very critical of the fact that they were duped into thinking these ideologies were going to work, and this is in the late 60s and 70s, certainly Dib and Kateb to some extent, but Boujedra was very, very damning and condemning of the FLN and what the state had become. But they also never abandoned French either, so that's another tension, Here you're condemning the state in the former colonial language, which creates a whole other set of problematic issues.
Thanks so much, Valerie. That was encyclopedic. I'm wondering, this is actually, will betray my ignorance. First of all, what was really interesting to me was the double colonial overlay. And I'm wondering is there a written form of Berber, and if so, is there a literature associated with that?
Yeah, when I was in Tizi Ouzou in 2014, I went into all these little bookstores in Tizi Ouzou who were publishing authors writing in Berber. And so I think now it's much easier to get published. For a long time you couldn't. And this is indicative to a lot of the changes taking place in North Africa, because of Morocco too. Berber now is part of one of the languages recognized officially by the king, and it's in the constitution. So in the 2000s, there's been a huge push to sort of renew Berber. But for a long time, and certainly in Algeria and in Tunisia too, and even Morocco, it was repressed. You just couldn't use it. I think in Algeria, I know in Tizi Ouzou, they have an Institute of Berber Studies at the university there. And everything was written when I was there in the three languages, French, Arabic, and Berber. So, Amazigh, sorry. Yeah. I tend to use that as a blanket term, but Amazigh, yeah. So I think, I think multiculturality is eventually going to be recognized. And that was Nabil Fares' big. One of the reasons why he told me, one of the reasons why he never would go, among other things, but he could not go back to Algeria was because he just felt that it wasn't his country, because he was so attached to his Berber identity.
Thank you, Valerie. It was really illuminating, and I think you almost gave a good word for the nouveau roman, which most students think is so difficult to read. And it's amazing to be able to even translate that. And you talk about tension a lot, and the tensions, and it seems to me that there is a kind of tension between the nouveau roman and its difficulties, and its no story, no narrator, and yet a very real context for socio-political change. And so that's part of what you were saying, I think, and we captured that. And I was wondering, who is the audience for some of these novels? Can they be read by people who want to, difficult question, to read the message, but can they read the text?
Well, I have to say that is a really good question, because when I teach Nejma, I'm cringing. Because that is just and I only teach it, of course, at the graduate level. And the last time I taught it, the graduate students, you haven't had that experience yet. But, Tell me. Yeah.
These books were read in France, not by the settlers.
Yeah.
It was the list of their concerns. So in France, we had an audience, like Jean-Paul Sartre,
Yeah.
Simone de
Yeah.
Beauvoir. Those were the people who read these books.
Right, yeah, and I mean, I was even, and now I think people, I was with colleagues in Algeria, and they're like, yeah, you know, we're teaching these, but it's a very academic writing. I mean, it's insane. I spent a year just trying to figure out Nejma, a year of my life, basically, trying to translate passages of that book into English were just, I mean, I just couldn't do it. I had to have help from a professional translator to make sure that, because I understood it in French, but I could not express it. I could not find the right expressions, you know, and that we would have in English to even, and then you need to know all of the entire Algerian history when you read Kateb. I mean.
But you know what? He was writing during the colonization. He didn't want the French colonizer to understand
it.
What he was saying.
Yeah, I mean, this is true.
Yeah.
So it's a double-edged sword,
It's
you know.
a double language. You
Yeah.
have to really know the
And this is true really for most writers writing in French in North Africa. I mean, you talk to Moroccans. I have done a lot of work in Morocco, and I talked to Abdelkabir Khatibi one time, and I said, how is it that you stayed out of jail for all those years? And he said, well, I just wrote stuff that people can understand. And you do. You read Khatibi, and you're like, I cannot understand. You know, it has some form, but so I think a lot of it was that, but I think there was this playful side to their writing, maybe later, you know, after independence, but where it got to be an art form. And that's what the Nouveau Roman is too. It's an art form. You don't read it to get a story. You read it to appreciate what they're trying to psychologically do with your head, you know. And I love the Nouveau Roman. I know that my colleague Joe hates it. And we have had many heated discussions about the Nouveau Roman, but he's never going to change my mind. Because I think it is just, there is so much that you can find. And I know Rocrier, I mean, you read about his autobiography and you cringe, you know, the guy was bizarre. But his novels are amazing. I mean, you know, and if you read Le Labyrinth, or Dans le Labyrinth, you're in a labyrinth and you're just spiraling down. And that happens in Kateb's book too. You get caught up in these spirals and you're just like, every sentence, you're like, wait a second, did I miss something? And it forces you. It really makes you read. And I think that's what they were trying, the message too they were trying to evoke was, we're going to force you to read the pain. I mean, Kateb's novel is very painful. I mean, just from what you learn about Algerian history, I think. But you know, that's the thing, that's why it's such a hard, these novels are all really, really hard to teach. I mean, because you just have to do so much contextualization of the history, and because they don't have meaning if you don't know the history. You know, I mean, this was an attempt to know that, and it, you know, and I dedicated. Well, I mean, I really started working on it, and I wrote to my advisor, Reda Vinsmaya, who's now retired, and I told him, look, I sent him the book, and I said, this is the book that 25 years later, you know, but this literature I started working on in graduate school. So for 25 years, I've been trying to understand it. And I guess now I feel like I have nothing to prove, and I can just do it, and if people don't like it, well, whatever. You know?
I'm glad to hear that, because I'm so glad to hear that. It really, there's nothing wrong with me, that I could not understand Nejma in high school. That was required. Yeah, that was required reading. I loved Steinbeck, The Grape of Wrath. That was required reading. That I could read easily. But Nejma, this is Algeria. So Nejma was not, and you I think our professor, I still remember because we had such a hard time, And the way he explained it to us, that it is concentric circles. And so he would point out once in a while how, where's the point where the circle, now you are deeper, and here you are on the outside. You call it the labyrinth, and the new...
The polygon,
but I am rereading now, Nejma. Maybe I'll understand better. Maybe after I read your book, I will understand better.
I would love this. I mean, I hope. I don't know. It's still, it's an American. When I was in Algeria, and I told my colleagues there that I was going to write this book, and they were like, "Why would you want to do that?" Why? I mean, we can't even read Kata Yasin. Why do you want to take this on? And I said, well, because it's a challenge. And I think when you're outside, because I'm outside. I'm not a native speaker of French. I'm not a native Algerian. I'm not a lot of things that if you are outside, sometimes you understand things more by looking, and I'm taking kind of an objective view of it. I'm not trying to label it in any way, but I just thought there's no way, and we even have some traces of Kateb having conversations, not so much with Nouveau Roman people, but he was in these colloques, where Rocrier was, or where Nathalie Sorot was. So I know, he just had to have been influenced by them. I mean, I can't prove it with pictures, but I know because, he was in Paris in the 40s and in the 50s, and again, he was like Ferres trying to figure out how to comment on all this socio-politically. Was not being called out by authorities or put in prison or whatever. So.
But the other novels, like Le Fils du Pauvre, was easy reading.
Sure.
Both easy reading compared to, they were not all.
Yeah. No, and I think Mouloud Faroun, that novel is always cited as being one of the last sort of ethnographic kind of writing before the revolutionary writing. But I even think Mouloud Faroun, if he had lived beyond 1962, would probably have become more, experimental in his styles. But I think that novel, it's canonical for being ethnographic and giving us a certain sense of what colonial Algeria was like. That's an easy novel. I do teach that one in undergraduates.
Dr. Orlando, can I ask you a question like we talk about in class all the time? I'm always asking about language and why, because I'm thinking about how in the Caribbean they write in French and sometimes it faces Creole or other pidgin languages, and how that seems to come across to me as something favorable, but talking about writing in French in Algeria is seeming to come across as unfavorable, even though I know they have like Arabic and Berber. And can we talk about language for a second? And the differences in French for both places?
Yeah, I think French, and I should let the Algerians probably speak on this question, but again, I'll say from my outside point of view, when I was in Algeria in 2014, so after the horrible civil war and things had, quieted down. But I was amazed after having spent a lot of time in Morocco and Tunisia, where the French is openly used and whatever, But I had never came across so many people who spoke such good French as I did in Algeria in 2014. Still, even younger people. So my question was, all this history of trying to get rid of French, and yet it still seems so anchored in the country. And so I don't think it's a language that's ever going to go away. Even Samir Toumi, who I just wrote an article on, who's a very new, he was born in 1968, so very new author, he writes, I mean, it's just incredible. I just cannot find any other Francophone context where the writing is so rich. I don't know if it's because I have an affinity for Algeria, but I just really find that the writing, the quality of the writing is just, it's never bad. I mean, it's never, where it can be kind of different levels in other places, but it's just always very nuanced and I think it is because you're always kind of, I mean, Samir to me told me, you're always kind of writing this little line of like, what can I really say, and just hiding things. I mean, this book, L'Effacement, is all about trying to not be erased by the weight of the revolution if you're born after the revolution. So still, there's this tension. But he's writing in French, so yeah, how many people are going to really read it, but I don't think, I hope that French never goes away in Algeria.
Yeah, I think it's not going away because after the years of Arabic being just what is taught in school, they reinstored back French in elementary school. So now kids finally get back to growing bilingual. So that's good. And what is more encouraging, I don't know, the last, I just read a book by Carter Adani. It's like 2017. She's born in the 70s and she's writing in French. So I was surprised, like if Algerian schools, and she was schooled in Algeria. I mean, she was not schooled in France. Now she lives in France, but she was schooled in Algeria. So if you could grow up, go to Algerian schools, public schools, and end up writing like she's writing, it's an absolutely wonderful book. So I think it's not going to go away.
No, and I mean, even during the Civil War, I mean, I asked Boualem Sensal, I went to see him at Bourg-Médès, and I said, how did you survive? He stayed there the entire Civil War, writing, and again, he said, oh, well, no one reads me because I'm writing in French. So in a way, it kind of saved him in a sense, but I think there's, French now, it's a language of resistance, to resist a lot of different things. And it's become a tool more so than I think other, like the Caribbean, for example, where you don't have to write so much, between the lines.
I remember what Katabi Yassin said when they asked him, why do you write in French? He said, French is un butin de guerre.
Un butin de guerre. Yeah, it's
ours.
Yeah, it is, and I don't think you can divorce after being exposed and intermingled with it for 132 years. I just really can't think, how you could eradicate it. And I mean, and even controversial figures. I was, Albert Camus, who's always been kind of, Kateb was very, very dismissing of him because he was, for them, so colonizing. But now there's this resurgence about Albert Camus and the study of him. There are all these conferences going on in Algeria on Albert Camus. So
yeah, because there is a new book that he wrote, La Misère en Kabylie.
Oh yeah, La Misère.
That's a very good book. And only him could write it in 1937.
Yeah, in 37, right. So I think. Yeah, I think it'll always stay. And I think people are, with the internet and everyone's just so more global, and I think people realize that if you have more than one language, you should use it, and it is a butin, but in a good sense, it's a treasure.
Yeah. There's also Boudjebra who wrote in French, but then
switched to Arabic. Yeah.
But in Arabic, nobody's reading.
But he was translating them in French. So he decided to come back to French.
Right. Yeah.
So it's also the readership. I think is more international to write in French. While if you write in Arabic, the Arabic novel is completely different, and so nobody's reading them.
Let's take one more question.
I just wanted to make a point that in Puerto Rico, for example, the U.S. tried to erase Spanish, but it didn't work.
Yeah, it depends on what region your colonizer is operating in.
Same thing in Algeria. The French, they tried to erase Arabic. But people spoke Arabic at home and French at school.
You mean
Well,
banned?
That's how we survived.
You mean banned it for publication, or you mean actually banned people
Yeah.
from speaking?
Yes,
Banned
we
it.
couldn't speak Arabic
Oh my
Yeah.
goodness.
among
Yeah.
ourselves.
Well, that goes back to Ferris's word map, because he takes all these different dates. You know, first the French tried to eradicate Arabic or Algerian dialect, and then the Algerians tried to erase French. And so you have all these different, very poignant dates on that map, and it's really interesting when you start looking at the language issues behind them.
What years were those bans on Arabic? When was that?
Well, all during
During the
colonial times.
colonization.
During the entire colony?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
I used to go to school, to Arabic school.
Underground.
Underground.
Underground. Nobody
Wow.
knew where we were going. We always said we were going to visit an aunt and grandmother, but we were going to Arabic school. Although I learned nothing from Arabic.
That sounds familiar in another cultural context.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all so much for this amazing discussion.